Okay, sorry about the disconnection. There was sudden glitch that we recovered now. Okay, so I was saying that with Java Bean we write a simple bean class, and then we use a standard action to access those properties. We talked about the namings and how we should how we should name our getters and setters so that they are accessible in our JSP. What we have is we will have an ID. Okay, the ID will be like the identifier. It will be the object that we can use to access that property. Okay, and then we will have another important attribute, which is class. So we want to see, so basically what this expression is saying is that there is an identifier or an object, if you like, which is from this class, string bean, right? And then if you run your project and go to source, you will see where how these expressions are actually converted into Java by the container. So other than ID and class, you have another attribute which is called type. Okay. So sometimes if you have a superclass, for example, right? Um, let's just let me see if they're white only sound. Oh, is let me see. Oh, can you see the screen? Let me know if the screen is back. Okay. Okay, thank you. So just as soon as there is a problem with the screen, please let me know. Thank you. So I will just quickly go back and show you uh, the slide that you missed. This was the slide you missed. We have an ID. Um, the ID is S, and then there is a class, right? So we know that this object is from this class. And if you go on to view source, you can find out how the code is converted into Java by the container. So type is another attribute that you can use. For example, here, if your object S, you want to change the type, let's say the string bean uh, can extend another class, right? If you remember inheritance in Java, for example, we can do class A extends B, right? So if you remember inheritance in Java, what the type attribute does, so when you use bean, when you say use bean and ID, let's say equal to obj, then you can define another attribute called type, right? So now your type can be either class B or class A, okay? Um, because class A extends class B, right? So you can change the type here. If you want to do polymorphism, for example, um, let's say class B is an abstract class, right? And if you want to do polymorphism, you can use type. Okay, so type is not frequently used. Type is not frequently used, but if you want to choose the superclass, or if you want to use, like I said, polymorphism in Java, in your JSP, you can use this attribute called type. So as you can see here, for example, you have a parent class called person, and then you have another class called employee, right? Then you can choose the type to be person, okay? Scope, we're going to talk about this. Class, we already talked about. So let's see what the scope means. This is actually important because a scope basically tells you who can see this and how long um, is the lifespan of the bean, okay, of the object. So we will have four important scopes: page scope, request scope, session scope, and application scope. So let's just go through them one by one and try to understand what each one means here. So let's start with the first one, which is a page scope. Using the page attribute value, okay, the bean will become only available to your current page. Okay, so if you move the control from one page to another, for example, by using JSP include or JSP forward, if you go from one page to another, then your bean will not be accessible anymore if the scope is page. Okay. So have a look at this example here. If you have this bean here and the scope is defined to be page, and then you have this expression forward, which will move the control. It will send the client from one page to another. And then if you go to the next page, this object message bin will not be available anymore. Okay. So this is about page scope. Remember, if you choose the scope of your bean to be page, once the control moves from one page to another, that object, that bean will no longer be accessible. Okay. Then we have the request scope. With the request scope, the accessibility is different. It's actually extended to the forwarded or included page. Okay. So if you do use your request scope and go from one page to another, then your bean will still be accessible. Okay. Well, you don't need to write answer the old questions anymore. Okay. So remember, if your scope is set to be request, if you use forward and you move from one page to another, the bean will still be accessible even here. Okay. Let's go to the third. There is a third scope. There's one demo. These demos on the slides, you can follow the instructions and try them at home. The demos that we have here. So there's step by step defining the use bean. Creating a bean in your JSP using standard action. Okay, so here we have a message bean. we have a bean, the ID is message bean, the scope is set to be request, which means that message bean will be available to the next page here, message bean 2. So we just want to see how this works. We go to another page and we try to get the property of the bean, and you can see that it works because the scope we defined was not page, it was request. The third scope is called session. Okay, so in a few weeks we will have a almost full lecture talking about sessions and cookies and how they're used in web applications. But for now, just remember when you change the scope to session, your bean will be placed in another object called session. Okay. Um, and then the session will exist as long as the object is alive. Okay. So the client has to, not the client, the server basically has to end the session, right? Or expire, or when the session is expired, then that bean will no longer be available. Um, if you set this session to be false, so if you use this directive in your JSP and set session to be false, then the scope session, then the bean that you create will no longer be available. Okay, so if you set this to false, this ID here, this object will not be available, and instead you will get an error, because if you choose the scope to be session and you set the session to be false in your JSP, you will get an error message. The next scope is application scope. This is basically the extended version of page, which means that your bean will be available across your application, not only in the current page, but everywhere. So if you have 10 JSP pages and if you set the scope to be application, your bean will be available to all the pages. There is this conditional bean operation, which means if you write the beans, if you write your standard action like this in this format, JSP use bean, and then inside you write statements. Okay, so there are two ways to write it. One, you can do it this way, right? So for example, JSP use bean ID date, and then close it here. Okay. There is another way of writing it, which is by using an opening and a closing tag. If you write it like this way, if you write your standard, if you write your element this way, okay, your use bean, if you write it this way, then your bean will be conditional, okay, which means the property values will be set only if a new bean is created. If an existing bean with that scope and ID is found, the body of tag will never run. So if you have, so for example, let me go back here just to make this clear. Let's say you have JSP bean ID, this should be use bean, right? ID obj class, let's say class A, and then you end it here, right? Let's say you have another use bean, but this time you're going to write it this way. like this. JSP use bean. This one will be conditional. Okay, so what happens here? Let's say you have the same ID here. And then let's say you have some JSP get property, or let's say set property, whatever. What happens here? Say we have name, whatever, we don't mind. If you write the same ID here in the conditional use bean, because another object with the same name exists, this line, this statement will not run. Okay. So that's what we mean by a conditional bean operation. Okay. So last week we looked at an example of set property and get property. If you remember, we saw how we can get the properties of a bean using set property and get property. So I think that's kind of clear. If you want to use scriptlets, right, you will need to do it differently. So for example, if you write get property message, and if you want to do the same thing using expression or scriptlets, you have to do it this way. Okay. So this is JSP get property. And when we say property message, we must have in our Java class, in our bean class, we must have a setter. Sorry, for get property, must have a getter called get message, right? Can anybody tell me what should be the name of our getter when the property is message? What should be the name of our getter? So let me write the question. What should be the name if the property in JSP is called message? Anybody knows the answer to this question? No, the property is called message, not name. So this is what we have. This is what we have. What should be the name of? No, not correct. So what should be the name of our getter, in Java? Remember a getter, so we have, let's say, public. What is the name of the class here? Let me see. The name of the class is a string bean, right? The name of the class is string bean. So if you remember from last week, we said What is a Java Bean class? What should the Java Bean class have? First of all, your Java Bean class must have a constructor with no arguments. That's rule number one, okay? We must have a constructor with no arguments. Second, if we have, and second, actually, our data members must be private. So we have private string. This can be anything. Let's call it MSG. But when our property is message in JSP, then the name of our getter must be get message. Public string get message. So the answer to my question is this. What should be the name of our getter if the property in JSP is called message? This is the answer. Must be get message. Okay. So let's move on. Likewise, a set property, we also talked about setting. So like just as you can get some properties using JSP, you can also set properties using this format. The name of your object, the property you want to set, and of course the value of the property. If you want to do it with scriptlets, fine, you can do it this way. The other interesting thing you can do with JSP is you can have a form like this and use a set property to get the value from the form to set the property. Okay. So we will see some examples here in the next pages, right? So we have a form like this. Type is text, and the name is MSG, right? The name of this text box is MSG, and this is what MSG is here. Have a look. MSG. And then when you send it, you can use this JSP to set the property, getting the value from your form. See how it works? And then this name must also be matching the name of your property and your Java class. Okay. You can set all the properties, okay, using this asterisk command. So this is the last form of set property I was going to show you, that you can set the property of set parameters of multiple properties, as long as the names of the properties are the same as the parameter names. So for example, here, if the names are matching, right? Let me go back to previous slide. So Let me find the slide with matching, right? So if the names are matching, right? So you can see here the name of the parameter is matching with the name of the property. As long as the names are the same, you can use this asterisk to set all the properties. Okay, and there is an example if you want to go and try. It's a very good example. I recommend you do it at home. You create a Java Bean class, and then you set the value of a message, and then you try to access it and change the value in different ways. Okay, so you will use get property to get the value of the string, and then you will use a set property. And here you're actually using scriptlets. And later you will change your file, you will change your JSP to add a form, okay? And then you try to get the value from the form, just like what we explained here. And then you try to do it with scriptlets once. So here I'm doing it with scriptlets. And then later you will try use bean in this next, not here, and the next page. Right, and then you try to get the value from the form using useBean set property. Okay, and then in the next slide you will see how to do it using asterisk. So if you go to the code, right, you can see how the property asterisk works if the names are similar. So all of that is, and you can see the output, right, if you try it at home. But you must be careful about the namings. Okay, so the namings are important. If you want to use this property here with the star asterisk, you need to make sure that this name is matching with the name of your text box and the name of your Java class, the name of the property in your Java class, right? So if this property is set to message, you need to make sure that the name of this property, right, which is a text box, is also message. If the names are different, then this asterisk is not going to work. This one is not going to work. So please let me know if there are any questions about this. I recommend that you try this demos at home. And I'm going to show you another demo on my Eclipse after the break. But if there are any questions about this example, please let me know. Or assignments, any questions about assignments, you can also ask me. So I'm going to give you short break. So let's have our 10 minutes break and we will come back with the rest of the lecture.